So welcome everyone to an introduction to HudsonUP. And I'm going to an introduction to HudsonUP and the history of universal basic income. It's presented by Susan Danziger and Albert Wenger of the Spark of Hudson. I'm Brenda Schufelt, the program director, and I'm here in the actual Hudson area library with Emily Shamidas, the library director. And we're very proud to be hosting an information session about this important pilot project in Hudson on the efficacy of universal basic income. So I thought, rather than read the bios of Susan and Albert, which are quite impressive, but they're available on the post of this event on our website, HudsonAreaLibrary.org, and you certainly should read them, but I will tell you about my experience with them. I meet a lot of people in my job as program director, and many of whom have just come to the area. They have a civic interest in Hudson, and they often have creative ideas and plans on how to improve the city. But when I first met Susan and Albert, they stood out to me because they asked questions and they listened. Since they'll be talking soon, I thought I would let you know that they are also really good listeners. They have been thinking about researching and discussing UBI for a while and are passionate about it being part of what can bring our country to a more equitable place for all. And they have worked with organizations already existing in Hudson and the city government to do this pilot the right way. So we'll hear from Susan and Albert first, and then there will be a question and answer period. And you can put your questions in chat to the host at any time, and then we'll be reading them back to Susan and Albert. We figure there's so many people that it would be hard for everyone to have audio and ask questions. So Susan will begin.
Hi. Well, first of all, I wanted to thank both you, Brenda, and you, Emily, for allowing us to come and hosting this program. You were big fans of the library and all of the programs that you do, and we're really looking forward to working hand in hand with the library once the Spark of Hudson opens, and even before then. So really appreciate what you've done for the city and our working together as well. In terms of the agenda today, Albert is going to kick it off with to discuss the history and philosophy around universal basic income, and then I'll talk some about the particular pilot HudsonUP here in Hudson. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and allow Albert to share his.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for coming out this evening to listen to this. Let's see whether we can get this technology working here. One moment.
And as Albert does that, I'm going to explain. So Albert and I are actually married, but we do like to do Zoom sessions in two different places. We are in the same house, but he's outside and I'm upstairs. So. All
right. Can I... Susan, can you give me a thumbs up if this is showing properly? All right, perfect. This evening we thought we'd use the opportunity to talk a little bit about the history and some of the philosophical thinking behind universal basic income. There's obviously a ton to say about this, and whatever we can say in a compressed time will, by definition, be just a small subset. And obviously, we'll have Q&A, so hopefully we can address questions that people might have.
Actually, Albert, sorry, the tab is showing up at the very top.
Yeah, that's okay. We'll leave that tab
okay.
there.
Okay, sounds good.
Just in case people are new to the term UBI, it stands for Universal Basic Income. And what it is, it's a guaranteed monthly payment. And the U generally is read as either universal or unconditional. In either case, what it means is it's paid to everybody, and it's independent of whether or not you're working, independent of your marriage status, and so forth. The B stands for basic, and this is the idea that this is enough to live. Maybe not to live in Manhattan, but certainly enough to live. And I is income, as in the idea it's something that you get again and again and again, and that is paid in dollars, not in some kind of voucher or some kind of service. So those are the three basic the three aspects that together come and make up a UBI. And so want to talk a little bit about history, and this is a super compressed short version that leaves tons and tons of things out. But it is useful to note that in the early days of the US, there was a bunch of thinking along the lines of a UBI. So for example, Thomas Jefferson suggested giving 50 acres of land to people who were propertyless. Important note, of course, land that we were taking away from Native Americans, this should not go without saying. John Adams had this point that every member of society should possess a small estate, and pointed out that this was important for some kind of thought of liberty. And maybe the most famous proponent of some sort of type of basic income system was Thomas Paine in an essay titled Agrarian Justice, which was published in 1797. And he went into a fair bit of detail on a system for taxing landowners in order to make payments of money to people when they were turning 21, and then to people when they were old. And this, in a way, was the closest that people came to thinking about some kind of wealth transfer and cash transfer at that time. Because as you know, Thomas Jefferson and Adams were thinking about land, and Thomas Paine, even all the way back then, was prescient enough to think that maybe the thing that people really need is cash. Now, what was the backdrop against all of this thinking? So the backdrop was that if you looked at England, and this is actually England today, shockingly, so it was, if anything, worse back then, roughly 1% of the population owns most of the land in the UK. And you can see that to this day, 30% of that is owned by the aristocracy, 18% is owned by corporations, 17% is owned by the ultra wealthy. So you add those together and you're well above half the land in the UK. So this was the important backdrop. And so these early American thinkers who thought about some kind of universality and some kind of idea of giving people something that they quote unquote hadn't earned, but just giving it to them, a lot of it was against this backdrop of inequality and understanding how that inequality ultimately played itself out into politics and other areas of life. So skipping a huge amount of history, what's been interesting about UBI as a concept is that it has really spanned the political divide. So you can have somebody as maybe libertarian and certainly pro-capitalism as Milton Friedman, writing about the negative income tax, and the negative income tax is one way of implementing a UBI. Milton Friedman wrote, "It is directly, specifically at the problem of property. It gives help in the form most useful to the individual, namely cash." And then you have Martin Luther King in his last book, which was titled "Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos of Community," right? The solution to poverty is to abolish it directly by a now widely discussed measure, the guaranteed income. We're likely to find that the problems of housing and education, instead of preceding the elimination of poverty, will themselves be affected if poverty is first abolished. Now you might go, why was Martin Luther King in 1968 talking about the now widely discussed measure, the guaranteed income? Well, the answer is because it was actually being widely discussed. And it wasn't just being discussed, it actually resulted in basic income tests in the US. Between 1968 and 1975, 8,500 families received a guaranteed cash payment right here in the US. And this was very successful. It had a lot of positive results. And on the strength of those positive results, we almost got, not a UBI because it would have been unconditional, but a basic income under Nixon. And it was Daniel Patrick Moynihan who drafted what was called the Family Assistance Plan. And it had the support of Richard Nixon, and it passed the House of Representatives, not just once, but twice. But it never made it to a vote on the Senate floor because it died in the Finance Committee. And an interesting footnote here is the reason it died in the Finance Committee was because the Republicans thought it was way too much, and the Democrats thought it was not enough. And so both of them decided, this is not good. And so we could have had a basic income, which could over time have been expanded into a more universal program, but well, we didn't. So something very important, though, happened subsequently. And this, I think, is one of the very important charts that everybody should have seen. And basically what this chart shows here is that after this time, so we're now talking past 75, starting around 80, there was what people refer to as the Great Decoupling, which is, if you just focus on two lines here, you focus on the gray line measures productivity. So productivity keeps increasing. And then you look at the blue line, but median family income suddenly stagnates. And if you go before that, so if you look at the 1950 to 1980s timeframe, all four of these lines are basically moving in lockstep. So this was the time when we were using more machines, we were becoming more productive, GDP was growing, employment was growing, and income was growing. They were all growing in lockstep. So it was an economy that in a way was working for lots and lots of people. But then something happened in the 80s, and we'll talk later about what that was, but something happened and suddenly these diverged. And basically productivity kept growing, GDP kept growing, private employment to a lesser degree, and then, but median family income for all intents and purposes stagnated. Well, this has brought us, and this is not even the most recent data, this data from 2016, this has brought us to a situation in the US today that is somewhat reminiscent of what I talked about earlier when I talked about how land is distributed in England. We now have a situation where the top 10% of Americans own basically 77, I think at this point it's like 80% of wealth. And the bottom 50%, which is the green here, is 1%, and it's represented in the dollar bill. You barely see that line at the bottom, right? So it's a very, very, very high degree of inequality. And so where are we now? Well, we're now, this is a very recent survey. This is from August, so just happened. We're now in a place where support for UBI is rising very rapidly in the US. And so this was a survey of registered voters. What it's showing is that over this very recent time frame from February to August, February 2019 to August 2020, that's the green bar, support has gone from 43% to 55%, where the should means people who believe that the US should have a UBI. Now, what accounts for this growth? Well, one of the things that accounts for it, obviously, is right now, in the most recent months, is the coronavirus crisis. Because we're seeing that many businesses had to shut down, many people lost their jobs, many people have no source of income, especially as unemployment benefits run out. And we would have been a lot more resilient had we some universal basic income system in place already. The other thing, of course, that accounts for this to a degree is the candidacy of Andrew Yang, who ran in the Democratic primary on a universal basic income platform. And Andrew Yang is speaking tonight at the online Democratic Convention. I hope he will mention universal basic income in that speech. And it's also important to point out that his nonprofit, Humanity Forward, together with the Spark of Hudson, are the two organizations that are supporting the universal basic income pilot. Now, let me spend a little bit of time very briefly to talk about some of the philosophical ideas behind UBI. One question that gets asked a lot is, people say, well, isn't this communism? And it's very important to point out that this has nothing to do with who owns the means of production. You could think of a UBI in a communist system or in a capitalist system. This is just payments going to people. And it says nothing about who owns the means of production. Now, personally, I think that markets are largely a good thing. Not all problems can be solved by markets, but markets can solve some problems very well. And one important thing to point out about UBI is that UBI makes markets work better. So for example, over the last 30, 40 years, lots and lots of people have moved to cities. Why have they moved to cities? Not necessarily because they love cities, but because it's the only place they can live and earn any kind of income. With UBI, people can live pretty much anywhere, and so it makes local economies possible again. UBI makes the labor market better. Why? Because it gives people a walk-away option from jobs. That makes the labor market better because it means employers have to offer better jobs. It also enables entrepreneurship. We talk a lot in the US about tech entrepreneurship, and it's very celebrated. But the reality of entrepreneurship in the US is that's been shrinking for several decades now. When we look at the kind of entrepreneurship of people opening, let's say, a small business, of opening a childcare center, of opening a corner store, that kind of entrepreneurship has been on the decline for a long time. Another interesting thing to look at is, in terms of the philosophy behind UBI, is to think a little bit about economic theory versus common sense. So economic theory, the idea behind UBI is to provide a floor so people can meet their needs. Now, economic theory, and I've studied a lot of economics, unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, but economic theory really makes no meaningful distinction between needs and wants. So in economic theory, anything somebody pays for is treated the same way. So for example, your rent is treated the same way as buying the 40th pair of sneakers. But in common sense, tells us you need a place to stay, but maybe after 20 sneakers, it's just a want. You want another sneaker. Maybe after 2 pairs of sneakers, it's just a want, right? So common sense makes a clear distinction here. There's a wonderful book that's probably in the library, or maybe is, and if it's not, we should have it there. It's called How Much Is Enough by Edward and Robert Skidelsky. And they have a whole chapter where they trace the history of this confusion and the commingling of needs and wants that modern economic theory has brought about and where it comes from. Another interesting thing to look at is to look at the philosophy, the thought about human nature that underlies the welfare view versus the UBI view. Much of welfare is sort of presented in terms of, well, people who are on welfare, they're lazy and they're selfish and they're not really contributing, and words like welfare queen, we're in politics and so forth. The UBI view of humans is that humans are naturally curious, that humans tend to look for purpose beyond themselves, that humans are capable of growth, and that humans prefer peace when given the opportunity over violence. Now, one of the things that's super interesting about this is that modern science actually tells us that the UBI view is right. And there's a wonderful book, it's a very recent book, by a Dutch journalist called Rutger Bregman, and the book's title is Humankind. And what Rutger does is pull together a lot of the recent science that shows that this view on the right, the UBI view, is actually scientifically founded, whereas the view on the left is a view that we can trace back to people like Thomas Hobbes in the book Leviathan, and obviously to politicians, and that this is a view that's more of a construct of what people thought humans are like, because it fit their purpose, the purpose of their narrative, whereas the scientific view has taken us more into the view that's also taken by UBI. Couple more things quickly. UBI also relates to the question of taxation. The chart on the left, which was put together by the Congressional Budget Office, shows the effective tax rate that people face. And the line to focus on here is the dark blue line at the top. And the problem with the welfare system is that people who are receiving welfare benefits, when they start to work, they often face 60, sometimes 100% tax rate, meaning they have an incredibly strong disincentive to work, because the second they start working, they lose their benefits. And so they might bring in some dollars to the work, but all their benefits go away, so the effective tax rate is 100%. In a UBI system, basically, you have a flat tax rate. You get the UBI, and then on any dollar you earn above that, because the UBI doesn't preclude earning more money, it doesn't preclude work, you just pay taxes on every dollar you earn above that. And so you don't wind up with these very strange situations where people have a strong disincentive to work because they would be facing effectively 100% or more tax rate. Another important piece of context is what's happened with money. And we don't really have enough time right now, but if people are really interested in this, I'm happy to dig into this a little more later. But this is a chart, a very recent up-to-date chart of the Federal Reserve balance sheet. And what you can see on this chart is that the Federal Reserve balance sheet, by the way, the numbers on the right, when it says 1M, that is $1 trillion. It was at about $1 trillion for a very long time. Then along came the financial crisis. It bumped up to $2 trillion. Then over a series of steps over the intervening years, it bumped up to 4 trillion. Then most recently in sort of 2019, the Fed was trying to shorten its balance sheet, but then the coronavirus crisis came and now we bumped up to 6 trillion. Where did all this money go? Well, this money mostly goes to commercial banks, and it's the commercial banks that decide where to put this money. And this whole process of the Federal Reserve creating money is called quantitative easing, or QE. And one of the fundamental tenets of basic income and UBI is that if we're going to do quantitative easing, if we're going to create money, shouldn't we be giving the money to the people instead of giving it to the banks? And this also speaks to the question that's often brought up as to how a UBI would be financed. Well, the way the bank system and the money creation system works would be one primary way of financing a universal basic income. Now, let me wrap this up by saying, people might go, gee, you're talking about a universal basic income, and you're talking about a change to the tax system, and you're talking about changes to how the Fed operates and the banking system. This is crazy. We can't possibly ever do all of those things. We can't make all of these changes. But I think this is the most important sort of philosophical aspect of UBI. It's when you see UBI not as one policy in isolation, but when you see it as part of a large transition. And what is that transition? Well, it's a transition from one age to the next age. And we've had two such transitions previously. We had a transition from the forager age to the agrarian age that happened roughly 10,000 years ago. And we had a transition from the agrarian age to the industrial age, and that happened roughly 200 years ago. And now we have another big transition, a transition to a new age. And if we look at what happened in these past transitions, we changed pretty much everything. So when we went from forager age to agrarian age, we went from migratory to being sedentary, from flat tribal societies to hierarchical societies, and so forth. When we went from the agrarian system to the industrial age, we, again, changed absolutely everything. We went from living in the country to living in the city, from extended families to nuclear families, from lots of commons to lots of private property. And these changes were driven by dramatic changes in technology. You know, we invented farming. Farming is a set of technologies. We invented industry. Industry is a set of technologies. And now we have a new set of technologies and new capabilities. And this brings me back to the Great Decoupling. The Great Decoupling started roughly in 1980. And we had really gotten computers to work roughly when? Roughly in 1980s. So this Great Decoupling is already part of this transition that we're in. And many things that we're seeing in society around us today are because we are here. We are in this transition. We're stuck in many ways in the industrial age, but in many ways we need to invent this new age. And I can put a very short plug for my own writing on this, which you can find for free. You don't even have to go to the library at worldaftercapital.org. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing and hand it over to Susan to talk about the HudsonUP pilot.
Unmute myself. And can you see my screen here? All right, awesome. All right, well, thank you, Albert. That was a great introduction to the history and philosophy of universal basic income. And yeah, now I'm going to talk about how universal basic income is coming to Hudson with the program that we've launched called HudsonUP. And as Albert mentioned, let's see if I can figure out how to, this is not changing. There we go. Okay. So HudsonUP, as Albert mentioned, is a It's a joint, I guess, a partnership between the Spark of Hudson and Humanity Forward. I'm not sure if you've heard about the Spark of Hudson. It's a building that we are launching hopefully in about, I guess, about a year or so from now. But the entity exists, and it's going to be a learning and training center located at 5th and Union. And we partnered up with Humanity Forward, which, as Albert mentioned, is Andrew Yang's not-for-profit. Funny story here. When we first came to Hudson, we had planned for quite a while to launch this this universal basic income pilot. It's something that Albert and I have believed in for a number of years now. And in fact, when Andrew Yang was considering launching his campaign to become president, he actually came to us, to Albert in particular, and to talk with him about his plans. And anyway, when that didn't work out and he was about to launch Humanity Forward, I guess Albert had seen him the night before he was going to announce the start of Humanity Forward and pilot programs they wanted to do. And Albert said, hey, we want to do this pilot in Hudson. And Andrew's like, great, let's do it together. So it kind of, and then the following day, as you announced Humanity Forward, he announced this pilot that we were joining efforts. I guess it was announced in upstate New York and only later around Hudson. So why Hudson? Well, as I mentioned, we are launching the Spark of Hudson, so we have the personal connection to the city. But aside from that, Hudson is such a perfect city to launch this pilot in. It's a small city, which means that with a few people who will be participating, and I'll get to that in a second, there'll be a big impact, we're hoping, on not just the individuals, but on the city itself. We see Hudson as a microcosm of the US. No surprise, there's a huge disparity of income wealth here. And we think that, that echoes what's going on in the rest of the US. And of course, lots of different kinds of folks, people with different racial identities, ethnic identities, people who are creatives, not so creative. So we just think it's a great place to sort of, we figured if it can work here in Hudson, then we're hoping that it'll be a place that can be repeated in a lot of small cities around the US. We've had amazing support from local leadership, beginning with Mayor Kamal Johnson, whom we approached way back when, and immediately he was on board and excited about it. And then also from various community groups. I know Joni Hunt is I think she's on the call here. She's been amazing, from Promise Neighborhood to Kite's Nest, Kaya Weidman, and throughout the folks in Hudson that we've spoken to have just really been so supportive and really embracing what we're trying to do here. And the amazing thing is that this is the first UBI pilot that's going to happen in a small city. And so when we spoke to the researchers, and I'll talk about them in a second, they were so excited that that the data that could come out from here and the stories will really make a big impact on the national debate that's going on for universal basic income. So the pilot itself, we wish it could be universal, but unfortunately our funds are limited. So there'll be 25 people who will be selected, each of whom will receive $500 each and every month for a period of 5 years. And so it turns out not only is it the first pilot in a small city happening in the US, it's actually the longest running pilot for 5 years. We are hoping that this will be the first of additional cohorts that will be launching next year and the following year. I suppose it really depends on the kind of support and other people, the funding that we can get to add additional people in the following years. But for now, it's 25. Eligibility. Folks have to be a resident of the city of Hudson, so those 2.2 square miles. Folks need to be 18 years or older, and they need to earn less than $35,153 a year. Sounds like an odd number, but that's actually the median income in Hudson, and so that's why we chose that number. So to enter, if you go to HudsonUP.org, if you are eligible, you'll see a big green button, enter there, and the I guess survey, what we're calling, or applications, or the way to enter there is open until September 20th at 11:59 p.m. So please do keep that in mind. You have a little time, but it always goes faster than one thinks. When you hit that green button, this is you'll see what we're calling a survey, this form that you fill out, and we've purposely made it fewer than, I think there are 10 questions in all. These are all the questions that are being asked, so it's really your email address, your name, first name, last name, your address, your phone number, your gender, your primary racial identity, your average monthly take-home pay, and the way you want to be contacted. And then you just have to sign here, type in your name here and click that blue button. So just to make sure that it goes through. It is a random selection, so there will be a lottery. We engaged, I mentioned the researchers, we engaged professors from the University of Pennsylvania and the University of Tennessee, and then more recently a researcher from CUNY, and they will be doing the drawing themselves. So there'll be, nobody in Hudson has anything to do with the selection. We wanted to make sure that this is completely separate from anyone. There'll be no favors. We won't know until the people themselves who are selected will know, or just slightly before them so we can tell them. But we have nothing to do with the process. There will be an equity component. And this equity component actually came out of a number of discussions that we had with the community. We really wanted the selection and eligibility process to be a result of lots and lots of conversations coming from the community. And this equity component actually came out initially from a conversation we had with Kaya Weidman from Kite's Nest. And the way it's going to work is we're going to use the Opportunity Atlas data set. And what that data set did is it studied I think it was about 20 million children from childhood through to adulthood, and to figure out what their opportunity for success is, or the likelihood of success throughout life. So things like income or likeliness of being incarcerated. And what they did was they took 4 factors as part of the data set. They looked at people's gender, their racial identity, their income, and where they live. And so based on those 4 factors, they could determine how likely one was to be successful in life. And so what we decided to do was to take those likelihood of success factors and turn them on their head. So those folks that were less likely to succeed would, in a sense, sort of have a higher likelihood of being selected. So imagine a lottery taking place. If you're, say, a white male living in an expensive part of town, earning, a good living, then you would, say, have fewer lottery tickets. Whereas if you were, say, a Black woman earning very little money, living in a poorer part of town, then you would get a lot more tickets. So we think this is we thought it was a really interesting idea that Kaya came up with, so did incorporate that into the selection process. A little bit more about the pilot. So the payments that people will be receiving, that $500, they will be unconditional, which means that there will be absolutely no strings attached. and which means that they can do anything with the money. They can travel with the money, they can start a business, they can stay home with the kids, they can take care of the elderly. Really, it's all up to them as to what they want to do with the money. They can blow it on the sneakers if they wanted to. The financial support for the project is, we mentioned that we were partnering up with Humanity Forward. So we're giving most, I guess, half and half, the money from us and Humanity Forward, plus JJ Reddick. If anybody, I think, is a basketball fan, he also gave a bit of a contribution to the pilot itself. The goals of the pilot are to empower the participants. We're hoping that that with the extra income, they won't have to worry about making rent or putting food on the table, or at least it will help. We think that we're hoping that the community itself will be strengthened when, you know, there are studies that have shown that when you get UBI, you spend more time with your kids who do better in school, for instance, and people may have more time to, say, volunteer or participate in civic service, maybe running for office, say. And of course, we wanted to raise the awareness of UBI through sort of educational components, such as what the library here is putting on for us right now. The team, so we have an advisory council in place. I'm sure you all recognize most, if not all, of the folks here. I mentioned Joni Hunt, who's been instrumental. Of course, the mayor, who's been a champion from day one. Kaya Weidman, Jabeen, Brian, and Ethan is from Humanity Forward here. And they've been really terrific. We've met periodically and have gotten wonderful input from them. And as I said, this was just the start. It really is about talking not just to these folks, but other members of the community in terms of how the process should run. You may have seen flyers going out, or mailers that have been sent to every house in Hudson. I did hear from someone they did receive a flyer, so hoping that that's not just a one-off. If you haven't yet received it, you will. It has basic information about the program and has also been translated into Spanish here as well. We're looking also to translate all the materials into Bangla in addition. And by the way, the survey or the application form will be both in English and Spanish. So you just have to choose when you're filling out the form of which language you want to answer in. Let me just once more, if you go to HudsonUP.org, you'll see that big green button that will lead you to the form. Again, the deadline is September 20th at 11:59 p.m. And we really encourage, you know, if you know folks who might be eligible, we want to really get a broad range of folks participating in the program. It's really important to us that it just not be from one part of Hudson or one demographic, that we really have people from every part of the city. And that's it. So, you know, if you have any questions, we'll be happy to answer them now. You can always email us at info@HudsonUP.org. And we, you know, hope that, you know, give us feedback, let us know how we're doing, and love to hear from you. And I'm going to stop sharing now.
Thank you so much. That was very informational. Really glad for the history and for the Hudson Up presentation. So I do have a few questions, and anybody who joined us a little late, there's a chat box that you can get from the bottom of your screen, and then it should appear in the right side, and just type in whatever questions you have, and I will see them and I can read them to Susan and Albert. So the first question: is there an age cap on the other end? So you said 18 and older. What is the cap? Older.
Yeah, you could be any age. So we welcome senior citizens and yeah, at any age. As long as you're 18, we welcome you to participate.
Okay. And the next question is, what factors will be used to measure what you say strengthening the community? How will you measure that?
Well, we're not going to be doing this ourselves, so there's a research team under the guidance of two researchers who've also followed the Stockton project, and then we have a principal investigator, and she will really be meeting with lots of people in the community and developing measurements based on that.
Okay, great. And the third question is, how are you confirming the income of the candidates? I guess
great question. When you fill out the form, we're asking you to certify that this information is correct. I think this goes back to somewhat of the philosophy here. So much of means testing and other things are putting hurdles in front of people from receiving benefits, and we're assuming that people are being honest. Absolutely, that runs the risk that some people won't be honest, but we believe by and large people will be honest.
Okay, thank you. Will the application also be in Bangla?
Yes, that's it's in the process of being translated as we speak, and so as soon as it's available, we'll be posting it as well.
Okay, great. And the next one is, will recipients be anonymous, the people who receive the income?
Yes, absolutely. We will try and keep the number of people who know who they are as small as possible, but obviously some of the people on the team need to know so that we can onboard them, but we will even do the onboarding for people individually if they so want, so that they can even be anonymous from each other.
Right. I mean, that's really super important to us, that people have the choice to be, to be private or not. In fact, it's quite possible that there might be a member of your family that could be receiving a UBI, and you may not know it.
Interesting. I also just got a message from our library director that not only can we help people fill out the application online, we have a reference and tech services librarian who's available by phone or online, but we also have Bangla translators here, so anybody who needs any help, and if anyone on this call knows anybody who would like to fill out the application and may not have that ability currently, especially with all of the things that are shut down, they can call the library. We will help them, and we'll also help with translation.
That's wonderful. And I also want to mention that thanks to Joni Hunt, there will be tables set up at various places around Hudson for folks who can help people with any questions or helping them fill out the forms themselves.
So our next question is, what if the person is a caregiver and they don't have any income? Would they be eligible, I think is what they're asking.
Yes, absolutely. There's no lower threshold. If you have no income, you're absolutely eligible. Okay. We've chosen to put an upper threshold at the median income, so that rules out roughly half the people, but
okay.
No lower threshold.
The next question is, for many people who make less than $3,800 per year, maybe it means 38,000, I'm not sure, receiving $500 per month would effectively make them ineligible for housing subsidies. How have you thought about all of this on a larger scale?
Yeah, so we've been in touch with the Commissioner of Social Services, Bob Gibson, and together we've been working hand in hand to ensure that the benefits that folks have, at least on a local level, aren't being touched. Now, that said, there's going to be, once the participants are selected, there's going to be counseling involved so that the person can understand so we can understand the benefits that they have, and then together we can figure out whether, in fact, they would like to participate in the program or not. We certainly don't want anybody to end up worse in the program than they started.
And the money itself is not taxable income. And it's not taxable income because of the way the program is constructed, involving an actual study with a principal investigator. That allows it to be qualified as a gift.
And that's one of the reasons why we chose the amount $500, is because it's below the threshold of what one's allowed to give without it being taxable.
Okay. Will the community have an opportunity to participate in the ongoing development of the pilot?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, we encourage, what we would love to do is really make this a community process. And so the researcher that Albert mentioned will be taking the lead here, but the idea is to involve lots of members of the community in various different phases. There may be a control group that's selected. There may be projects like arts projects or other kinds of projects whereby people can express what the outcomes of UBI have been. So we really encourage people to come forward with ideas as to how they may want to participate in the project going forward.
Okay, thank you. And somebody would like to know, what was the genesis of the Spark of Hudson?
Susan, you want to go for this?
Sure. So the genesis meaning the idea behind it or the name?
I think they mean the idea behind it. I know
Okay.
the person, so I'm gonna think.
I think, Albert and I have always been super interested in education, and not just education unto itself, but the possibilities of people and what they can aspire to be and to learn. And we think of education as a lifelong learning, and that we're all both students and we're all teachers. And so every program that we do at the Spark will really kind of hopefully tap into what the community can offer in terms of teaching and learning. And we're hoping that through the programs we offer, people will learn everything from philosophy to gardening to economics to financial literacy. Yeah, Albert, is there something you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, we think one of the most important ways to make progress generally is to give more people access to more knowledge, and the Spark is about that. Part of what we will do in the kickoff meeting with every participant selected in HudsonUP will be to make them aware of all the resources and programs that they will be able to access, not just through the Spark, but for example, through the community bank that we're working with to learn about financial literacy. So yes, access to knowledge is something that we care a lot about and think is sort of a foundational element of progress.
Okay, great. And someone is asking, will people lose their benefit if they get this money? I know we talked about the housing benefit, so I think you made that pretty clear.
Yeah, so we can't make any blanket guarantees because there are a myriad of different benefit programs. And so we can't categorically say nobody would lose benefits. What we can categorically say is that we will work with every individual participant to make sure that this program actually makes them better off. So once somebody has been chosen to participate, if for whatever reason it turns out that they would be net worse off, they can always say, look, I don't want to do this. So we think that's unlikely, but it's certainly something that we will work through on a case-by-case basis. And we very much hope that the way we've constructed it, this will be the edge case and hopefully will not happen at all.
Right. And one thing I wanted to add was that please, everyone, don't not apply because you think that your benefits will be threatened. We are going to, work with, as Albert said, work with everyone and figure out on a case-by-case basis. You can certainly decline it, but don't knock yourself out thinking that it may affect your benefits.
Okay, and somebody is asking, is anonymity realistic for a small town? Will it create more problems than it solves? So
it's a totally fair question, and I think that we're going to try our best. Could it create problems? we hope that by having everybody involved early on and talking a lot about it and talking a lot about the objectives and so forth, that people will be excited and happy for whoever gets to participate. And that's certainly been the case in other trials that have been conducted elsewhere. So we hope that's the case here as well, that people are excited that this is happening and aren't jealous. But yes, at the end of the day, I grew up in a very small town in Germany, and sometimes things get out that you'd be surprised. Again, we're starting from a place of anonymity and hoping that people will respect that.
Okay. The next question is a question I can answer. Is the application separate from the initial application that was filled out to get acknowledged for the call that was received to join this chat? Yes, it is separate. So you have to go to HudsonUP.org and the application will be there. And again, if you need help, you can always call the library for any technical assistance. Next question. How will we know the impact of UBI versus a random selection of folks with similar characteristics and no UBI?
Yeah, so there are quite a few scientific approaches where people are doing strict control groups. The biggest one of those is happening at the moment in Kenya through an organization called Give Directly, where they really are truly testing a UBI in the sense that they're selecting entire villages and then everybody in that village receives a universal basic income. And they're randomly selecting villages and they're comparing outcome between villages that have been selected and ones that haven't. So all of this is a way of saying we are not going to be able to do that here in Hudson because A, we have very small numbers, and B, because we're trying to respect people's anonymity, we will not be able to and we are also not requiring any of the participants to even talk to the researchers. We're taking more of an ethnographic research approach. So our principal investigator will spend a lot of time in Hudson just meeting with people and talking to people. And so this will not try to aim for statistical power. This will try to aim for providing really interesting insights into the lives of individuals and maybe also into what happens in the community. There are and have been other universal basic income trials that have focused on statistical power, and the results from all of these have been fairly positive, which is why Susan mentioned earlier, our goals here are less to come up with a statistical conclusion, but rather to help improve people's lives and also to help drive further awareness of why this is such an important policy and why this policy needs to be pursued more than it has been to date.
Next question, will you request confirmation of statements regarding public assistance from county DSS or request IRS information as part of the income statement? So I think you did answer that as you're not.
Yeah, we're not going to verify people's income. We're going to treat people with the assumption that they're being honest.
So you spoke about the program being ethnographic in approach, and someone has a question, how will the success of the program be measured then?
Yeah, so the nice thing is that this is unfolding over many years, and the success will be measured in the impact on people's life who are receiving it. And that won't be measured just in a few numbers, because we generally don't think that people's lives should or could be reduced to a few numbers. People's lives are very multidimensional and there are many aspects to it. So this will center around understanding where people are today and where they are, what their journey looks like over the course of 5 years.
Okay. And when will the pilot commence?
So it has, oh, I see. So, well, the applications or the forms are now open. The deadline is September 20th. And then folks will be, it'll take, I think, just within a week, the algorithm will be run and we'll start notifying the participants that have been selected.
Okay.
And we expect to be for people to be able to receive payments either in October or at the latest in November. Some of this will depend on setting up bank accounts and so forth, and working through people's individual benefit situations, just again to make sure that people are in fact benefiting from this.
Right. And interestingly enough, so the plan is that when we give the money will go out in the 15th of every month, because from what we understand, people struggle really at the end of the month. And so we figured, if it comes into the bank account, say on the 15th, then it'll help them kind of bridge those last 2 weeks.
All right. And someone wants to know, once again, if the income is taxable or not. I'm just double checking.
No, the income itself, the $500 a month, are not taxable.
Okay. And where is the $500 coming from? How does one anticipate paying for UBI in the future? Local government, state, federal?
Yeah, so for this pilot, it's coming half from the Spark of Hudson and half from Humanity Forward. But the larger question of where UBI can come from at a local or state or even national scale, obviously in the time of budget shortfalls, this is a really difficult question to answer at the local and at the state level. At the national level, it's very different because the nation as a whole has the ability to create currency, and we do create a lot of currency, as that chart earlier showed. So now, there are efforts underway to also create, again, local currencies. And there's a long history of local currencies, not just in the US, but around the world. Across the border in Massachusetts, there are Berkshires. In Kingston, there's the Hudson Current. In Hudson, there's the Hudson Bond. Now, some of these are still what's called fiat-backed currencies. In case of the Hudson Bond, in fact, there's $2 that go in for every $1 of Hudson Bond that is issued. But there's also a long history of local currencies that are not fiat-backed. And there are, again, experiments in the US and elsewhere now as part of this crisis with local currencies that are not fiat-backed. That means municipalities, in conjunction with local issuers, are issuing currency that is used in that municipality. That may be a way to create basic income, a modest level of basic income at a local level, and is certainly something that Susan and I and others have been actively thinking about and working with people to go explore that. But there are lots and lots of tricky issues that need to be resolved, including legal issues. And so while this is promising, it's not something that can be done overnight.
Okay. And then another person is asking, wouldn't the full test be if everyone gets it? Socially, it seems that the universal part of it is the most important thing to test. Otherwise, it's winners versus non-winners.
Yeah, so this is obviously true, and something that's being done in Kenya. It would be very costly to do this, even at the level of a city like Hudson. And what our experience has been, so Susan mentioned earlier that we've been longtime supporters of this. We've been supporters of initiatives like this in other parts of the world, and also to a degree in the US. For example, we helped bring the Economic Security Project into existence, which then helped create the Stockton pilot. And what we have found is that even when it's not universal, even when just a few people receive it, it does a couple of different things that we think are incredibly valuable. One is it makes a huge difference in those people's lives. And then the second is it gets this kind of discussion going, this type of discussion about a policy that otherwise feels very abstract, and it feels like, oh, this seems like a weird dream, and could this make a difference, and how does it make a difference? And so making something concrete, even when it's not the thing that you ultimately want, we believe is a big step in the right direction. And we're spending this time up front to talk to lots of people about it, recognizing that only very few people will receive it. And what has also been the case often is that people will make changes, even in the small, that then will benefit lots of other people in their immediate vicinity. So the ability to radiate out even from 25 people, we think is quite powerful.
Okay, thank you. How will the recipient's journey be tracked?
So we're going to have, as we mentioned, this researcher who will be hopefully spending quite a bit of time in Hudson with the participants, if they so choose. And she'll be asking questions, hearing stories, and will then be publishing papers, hopefully, or the thought being together with the community. We really want this to be a community-driven process in terms of the research. So we're hoping that folks who want to help with that research paper will be participating as well. So but the hope is that publications will come out, potentially tapping in also to the, as I mentioned before, the creativity in Hudson. So we imagine different kinds of artworks. We know that there are oral historians around. They may want to get involved. Potentially, hopefully the library will be a part of it. So we really look to the people of Hudson to want to get involved.
We should curate a bookshelf of UBI books in the library. We can work with you on that.
Yes, and I was told by our board president, who looked up How Much Is Enough by Arnie Skildelsky, that it is available in our library.
It's a great book, highly recommend it.
Is there an inflation factor built into the $500 over the 5 years? And also in relation to this, someone else asked, why the $500? How did you come to that amount?
Yeah, so the $500 is what can be done without triggering a lot of problems. And so the second you start going a little bit higher, the risk of people actually losing benefits goes up pretty significantly. So effectively, you know, if you try to do $800 or $1,000, the net transfer often would be, you know, significantly reduced. And that would mean that the same amount of money could effectively help fewer people. Mm-hmm. As far as inflation goes, this is maybe a complicated answer. We're living in a very strange world at the moment, where because of technology, we have had a lot of deflation. Now, there are some things that have been exempt from that deflation. So the cost of healthcare have only been going up. The cost of education have only been going up. But lots and lots of other things have been getting cheaper, significantly cheaper. Obviously, some of those things are, you know, things like computers and mobile phones. But even other hard goods have been getting cheaper for many years now. And we're finding, the reason I'm saying we're finding ourselves in a strange world is because at the same time, though, there's been this huge amount of money printing that I showed in this earlier chart. And so we are in a weird period where we've had very low interest rates, where we've had low inflation, but where we have what people call a tail risk, meaning it's unlikely to happen, but if it does happen, it would be very bad. We could find a very bad inflationary shock. For now, we have not built an inflation adjustment into this. If there was some kind of terrible inflationary shock, we would obviously have to revisit that, because if money is suddenly worth half, you know, we would have to figure out how to adjust for that.
Okay, great, thank you. Are you not concerned that reliance on self-reporting may undermine the pilot's statistical credibility as a model for wider acceptance?
Yeah, so because we're not aiming for statistical approach, but for a storytelling and ethnographic and deep study approach, we're not really concerned about that.
Okay. And here's an interesting comment. It would be interesting to measure before and after cortisol and markers of stress to see if there is improvement with this cushion in a physiological sense.
That would indeed be interesting to measure if anybody of the participants would volunteer for that, but we're certainly not going to require any kind of invasive blood tests for people. There is a really fascinating book on scarcity, and it studies the impairment, basically the impairment in decision making that people who suffer from acute scarcity, in particular from a fear of becoming homeless, a fear of not being able to put food on the table. And the sort of impairment is as significant almost as being fairly severely inebriated. And this is widely studied in this book, which I'm sure is in the library also, called Scarcity. I would highly recommend to people because it pulls together a lot of the scientific evidence on this. And yes, very much the opposite here is by putting a floor below people, it can remove this scarcity fear and allow them to make better decisions in life, important decisions, like decisions of what kind of work to pursue or what to do with their family and so forth, what to do with their personal health.
Right. There was actually Rutger Bregman, whom Albert referred to before, talked about they measured farmers right before they were going to have their crops. So it was the end of, they were, had very little, and they were sort of anxious to see how that crop would go. And their IQ was significantly lower than after the crop, and they had an abundance. So that's a great book. Again, Rutger Bregman, who wrote about both universal basic income and the new book that Albert, what was it called? The latest one?
It's called Humankind.
Humankind.
And the prior book is called Utopia for Realists, and it's a book just about UBI, and it's probably the best book about UBI. And I say that in all deference to Andrew Yang's book.
Okay. The next question is, the Great Society programs have in effect eliminated poverty. Aren't we just tinkering at the edges? Not sure I agree with that, but anyway.
I don't agree with the premise. We haven't eliminated poverty.
Okay. All right. This way of are you open to bringing new research groups into the project to examine impact over time?
Sure. Absolutely. If somebody has recommendations or suggestions, please send them our way.
We're also just to let y'all know that we're looking to sort of open source all of the knowledge that we're gathering here, and in fact are creating sort of handbooks for other communities. If they want to create pilots in their own communities, they can look at our handbook. All the materials that we have, we're going to be publishing or putting online so that others can use them and benefit, and similar with the research itself.
Okay. And someone is asking, are you requiring accountability or cooperation to any extent with the researcher? But that must...
No, we're the only thing we're requiring is that people go through the initial kickoff meeting, where we will explain to them why it would be great if they did, but it is an unconditional basic income and not a many strings attached basic income.
Okay, great. And I think we have an ending. We've been getting a lot of thank yous to both of you and to the library for hosting the event. So this is a wonderful comment from someone. We can't let this session end without saying thank you so much to you both. You could have come anywhere, but you came to Hudson. With all that is happening in this year, 2020, your presence in our community is educational and hopeful. And I'm getting more thank yous from people. So thank you so much for presenting this information and for really doing the work in the community of learning about Hudson. And as I said in the beginning, listening and asking questions so that this pilot could run in a very good way. So we really appreciate it.
And we appreciate your hosting, and also we appreciate everybody taking the time to listen and to ask questions and to provide input. And if you think of anything afterwards, just go to HudsonUP.org and you can leave a comment there that goes directly to us.
Okay, and I'll say just to finish that we have recorded this session and it will be available on the library website. We can put up a couple of other things We just released on social media a link to an Andrew Yang podcast that Susan and Albert were on that was wonderful. And something's really sticking with me. I won't take the time to read the whole thing, but Albert commented in this podcast about how people in the United States right now, with the precarious incomes that they have and the situations of stress that they're in with jobs, they cannot properly participate in democracy, and that UBI can give people the freedom to engage in democracy in a much deeper way, much deeper than just voting. So that was a very useful podcast. It keeps coming back to me for obvious reasons, I think now. But thank you all, and thank you, Albert and Susan, for doing this. It's just wonderful.
Thank you.
Good night, everybody.
Good night, everyone.